Okay, so thanks again. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to share some of my research journey with some of my colleagues here today. It's a very different presentation than what we just heard from Dr. Reese and Dr. Messina. I am part of the environmental science group in APUS, but this is really more of a history-focused presentation and research. So it's a nice crossover, and I hope you enjoy. So I'm going to give you a little synopsis. I'm going to provide you my research activities initially, then provide a synopsis of the findings and kind of a go-forward plan. So I just want to give this background to provide the audience with a little context, and also to express my gratitude for APUS and their support throughout this process. This project on President Kennedy's environmental conservation program really grew out of the original research I started back in, believe it or not, in 2011. And I was part of a friends group for the Merritt Island Wildlife Refuge. So we're the group that helps the refuge and support different projects. It meant a lot to me because not only am I on the board of the refuge board, but I also worked at the Kennedy Space Center on the shuttle program. And the Merritt Island Wildlife Refuge, well, the Kennedy Space Center is in the middle of the wildlife refuge. So they have a parallel history. And I decided in 2011, being on the board, in 2013, we were going to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the refuge. And I thought, I'm going to do a little research, see if I can come up with maybe a short summary, an article for our refuge newsletter, just to give them a little context and help with the celebration that the Fish and Wildlife Service wanted to do for the 50th anniversary. I was able to use some local resources such as the Kennedy Space Center archives. We just happen to live in the county where the Florida Historical Society is, so a lot of good resources there as well. And as I started doing this research, it became apparent, I think, as we all find when we do research, that there's a lot of things to start looking at once you open up one door and you see all these other doors. It's kind of like a video game. Like, oh gosh, now what door do I want to go through, and which one's going to be fruitful and which one's just going to be really interesting and maybe not fruitful. At the same time I was doing this research, APUS started, or at least I became aware of research grants, and I applied for a couple of them. And I was able to get some awards and do some additional research outside of the locality here, including the Kennedy Library in Massachusetts, the National Archives in Baltimore, University of Florida Holdings, Roger Tory Peterson Institute up in Jamestown. So I was very fortunate to get this and start looking into this issue a lot deeper. Well, as I mentioned, I started in 2011, and finally, in the fall edition, 2020, of the Florida Historical Quarterly, they were able to publish my findings. But it actually didn't get published to 2022 because of the pandemic. So it was a long journey, and I hope this next journey won't be quite as long. But I did want to mention, too, if you look at the Historical Quarterly journal there's a picture of President Kennedy, and he's speaking at a conference. To his left, or to our left, is Stuart Udall, who we'll talk about here shortly. And so this was a photo that I was able to get from the Kennedy Library, and the Historical Society decided to use that as their cover for this particular issue, which focused on environmental and conservation issues. But one of the themes that I got out of the research that I did initially was that there was something special about the Kennedy administration. And I felt that they were on this cusp where they helped to foster the transition from a conservation culture attitude to environmentalism. And I called that the culture of conservation. The process here, is a qualitative research, exploratory method. Like I said, you start looking at one thing and it leads to another and to another, and the challenge, of course, with any research is like, when do I stop? But as I got into the Kennedy part more, I realized there was a real important piece that I had not been able to obtain, and that was Stuart Udall. Being the Department of Interior Secretary under Kennedy, he was instrumental in establishing this culture. So the grant that I applied for and was granted allowed me to travel to the University of Arizona to visit the center and spend several days looking over boxes and folders from Stuart Udall and his colleagues. Also, I was able to use the JFK library online when I first did the research. And I went to the JFK library. They didn't have the online resources. So this was really wonderful. And then there's also several online sources, including our wonderful Trefry library. So from the project summary, if you want to just look at this in a few sentences, it was really, the Kennedy administration provided what I think is the transition from conservation to environmentalism. And Kennedy said it, I think, most succinctly in his message that he made at the White House Conference on Conservation, is that we want this administration, this government, to be identified with this cause of conservation. And I can think of no more suitable effort for an administration which is concerned with progress than to be identified in a sense with past efforts and future efforts to preserve this land and maintain its beauty. So I think Kennedy was really reaching backwards to those who preceded him in the presidency, especially the two Roosevelts, but he was also looking toward the future. And when you start looking at how are we taking care of the earth and the environment today to allow our future generations to be able to live the suitable and the same level of living that we have now, that's really sustainability. And so maybe that term wasn't used back then, but to me, it started to looking at, more long-term and how are we going to make sure that we preserve and not just conserve so future generations can look at it, can also live a prosperous life. When you start thinking about the new frontier, I think it's often associated with the space program and landing and sending men and landing on the moon and returning safely. But under Kennedy, the new frontier really did expand to Earth activities. There are several key players. I mentioned Stuart Udall, but we can't leave out Rachel Carson and President Lyndon Johnson. And the influencers mentioned already, President Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt, but also an important player was Gifford Pinchot, who was the chief forester for Teddy Roosevelt. And I kind of equal Pinchot with Stuart Udall. When Pinchot was the forester, there wasn't a Department of Interior per se. He was really the head forester, but they've played similar roles in influencing their presidents and in their conservation programs. So just again, some more context. When Kennedy was running for president, Eisenhower had been president for 8 years. And Eisenhower kind of turned his back on conservation. He didn't go forward with a lot of the progress that had been made up to that point. He really felt that a lot of these issues that were conservation related really belonged to the states and were not the purview of the federal government. So he did not go under support projects such as dams and reservoirs that were used for irrigation and hydroelectric. You might pause and think, well, those don't really sound like conservation issues, building dams, and providing water for farming and irrigation and potable water. But at that time, in the 60s, that's what really was conservation was a big part of. It was to make sure that we have a wise use of our resources. So, and again, Ike didn't really want to use federal funds for that. He thought that was state issues. During the campaign, Kennedy wanted not just to expand these projects for dams and reservoirs and to irrigate deserts and to provide recreational areas at the reservoirs, but he wanted to have more parks. He felt that in the United States, had a growing middle class. They had more money, they had more leisure time, there were more roads that people could travel on, and he wanted people to be able to enjoy and partake in our national and state parks, refuges, and national monuments. And he wanted those not just that were out west that were already formed, but he also wanted those to be more accessible to the larger portion of the population, which lived in the East and Midwest. And not only that, he also wanted to have urban centers to have access to parks. So maybe not a place you had to get in your car and pack up the family, but actually something you could go for into a day and go for a picnic and just get out away from the city and get into some fresh air. Kennedy also wanted to address water and air pollution issues, which again, Eisenhower felt were state issues, but as we know, pollution doesn't recognize political boundaries. So air and water pollution issues are really more countrywide, worldwide than they are statewide. So just a quick summary of some of the accomplishments that I thought Kennedy was able to do in his short tenure. And I think you need to look at what he did right away. 1961 March, not 2 months after he was inaugurated, he sent a special message to Congress on conservation. And in this message, he laid out what his plans were, some of his legislative goals, and especially his conservation issues and preservation. He followed that up with a dedication to the National Wildlife Federation building in Washington, D.C. within a week or two after that special message. And then in 1962, he hosted a White House conference on conservation. And this was, again, looking back, there had been a White House conference on conservation in 1908, where Theodore Roosevelt invited all the governors from each state to partake in this conservation conference and to look at what we can do to better conserve our land. So Kennedy brought this back. And again, Roosevelt was a great influence on Kennedy's programs. So what I'd like to offer is let you hear what Kennedy said at the conference.
Back many years ago, a distinguished French marshal, Marshal Leoté, asked his gardener to plant a tree, and the gardener said, well, this won't find its flowers for 100 years. He said, in that case, plant it this afternoon. That's the way we all feel about conservation. It won't come this afternoon, but we ought to get started this afternoon if it's ever going to come. Thank you.
Kennedy had several important bills and legislation proposed, and I laid them out here: the Land and Water Conservation Fund, the Wilderness Bill, the Youth Conservation Corps, which was similar to the Civilian Conservation Corps under Franklin Roosevelt in the Depression, Federal Water Pollution Control Act, amendments to the Clean Air Act, but maybe most importantly, and the game changer, was federal acquisition of public lands. In 1961, Kennedy was able to get through Congress the acquisition of the Cape Cod National Seashore. This was the second seashore, the first one being on the Outer Banks in North Carolina. But what was different about this seashore, and what was different about the whole acquisition process, is that Kennedy was able to get Congress to use federal funds to acquire the lands. Now, Kennedy was a senator from Massachusetts, as you're aware, and he had proposed preserving Cape Cod as a national park of some sort back in the mid and early 50s, or excuse me, late 50s. But he did spend time there with his family. And when he was able to get all federal land that was used for parks or refuge or monuments up to this point had either been donated by states, transferred by states, donated by private landowners, or was already existing federal lands. So when he did this, he moved the needle quite a bit. And when he signed the legislation approving Cape Cod National Seashore, he looked over at his Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, and said, what else do we have to preserve? I think they kind of had that all kind of worked out, but they were able to go up pretty quickly after that and put in 2 more national seashores, one in Point Reyes in California and another one in Texas at Padre Island. So and then everything else from here on out to what we're still doing today is mostly funded by at least from the national level, by the federal government. I think it's also important to note too, there's some major players, Rachel Carson and Stuart Udall, who are pictured here. Rachel Carson, I think we probably all know, was the author of Silent Spring, which identified the unintended consequences of pesticides, not just on the birds that were dying from applications, but also on implications for human health. She had been a well-known author actually before that. Sea Around Us was published, I think, in the late 50s. And it's just worthy to note, I think, she was also on Kennedy's election staff, on his campaign committee. And she served a role in kind of a prominent role in some cases, as she was one of many people who was considered a prominent citizen in an advertisement that was in many national or many newspapers in the United States that talked about supporting President Kennedy. Stuart Udall had been a congressman from Arizona prior to being selected as Secretary of the Interior, and he had been very successful in preserving land in Arizona as a congressman, and then of course took this forward in his position as the DOI Interior Secretary. But he also put out a book in 1963 called The Quiet Crisis, which went and looked at our conservation issues from a historical standpoint, how we treated Native Americans, or perhaps mistreated, as he wrote in his book. But then again, what we need to do to go forward to resolve issues related to pollution that were emerging at this time. One of the last things that President Kennedy did during his tenure was to take a trip out west in September. And this trip covered several different states, and I'm going to let him tell you where they went.
This is the end of a 5-day trip, which has taken us from Pennsylvania to dedicate the home of Gifford Pinchot to the cause of conservation, to northern Wisconsin, to Duluth, Minnesota, to North Dakota, to Wyoming, Montana, Washington, Oregon, California, and now we complete that swing here in Nevada.
So I think it's worth noting that, he started with Gifford Pinchot's. He went there to the opening of the Institute there and did the dedication. His next stop at Wisconsin, where Senator Gaylord Nelson, who had been the governor and had created somewhat of the blueprint that Kennedy's administration and many subsequent administrations used for their conservation program. Gaylord Nelson, of course, is considered the father of Earth Day and started, was very much involved in the first Earth Day in 1970. But we also know that there was unfinished business. When Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, almost all his major bills had not been gone through Congress successfully. And it took Lyndon Johnson and his skill set of being able to convince the Congress to pass these bills. And Johnson, kind of played it a little bit. He put JFK as a martyr. And of course, this worked really well. I think, we know from for the civil rights bills that were end up passing, which were obviously critical and that Kennedy supported, but it also worked out for several of the conservation bills, including the Wilderness Bill, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is what we use today to fund ongoing operation as well as acquisitions of new federal lands, and the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. And these were just a few. I could spend much more time discussing several of these, but just to give you a flavor. So one of Kennedy's relatives in a 2017 interview was recorded as saying that, so all the things that President Kennedy stood for and spoke about are still part of the national conversation. And I think that's true. So I think when we start looking at President Kennedy's, where does he stand in the pantheon of environmental presidents? You know, he may not be as good as Teddy Roosevelt, but he only had two and a half years. And, you know, maybe not as many accomplishments as some of our more modern presidents that have been able to save more lands, but he did. I thought he did a lot, and I thought he really pushed us toward that next level, which we needed to get to get us to be environmentalists. So my next steps for this is I've got about a 24-page manuscript that's I'm putting the finishing touches on, and I'll be looking for opportunities to either present and or publish. So thanks for your time, and feel free to you know, ask me any questions if you have any.
Thank you. That was excellent and so fascinating. A lot of history that I didn't really know about. Folks who are here, feel free to come off mute or type in the chat. I'll kind of start you off with just a research-based question, and that's what's it been like for you to do archival research, and what did you learn about how to do archival research as you've been doing it? Great.
And I guess it's a good thing for people like me who kind of have an introverted side, who can just go and, you know, bury themselves into a folder that comes out of a box and have this anticipation, like, what am I going to find? I mean, it's kind of a fun thing in a way. But, you know, there's also that part that you have to be disciplined, in that I'm going to spend the next 8 or how many hours that librarians going to allow me to spend here doing this work and writing stuff down. And actually now with our phones, it's really a lot of taking our photos and then coming back and taking a look at them and going over all the literature. So I think it's a fascinating, and again, you know, someone who is more science-based in training and education than to kind of do this turn a little bit. I can't wait to do another project.
Thank you. You have a nice comment from Dr. Reese there in the chat. Would anyone else like to ask a question or make a comment? I, for one, am looking forward to this article that you're writing, so I think it'll be a great contribution.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Charlie, it's Danielle. I have a question for you, considering I put a little blurb in there about really enjoying the fact that you were able to find those audio clips, because it really brought in that context and really brought us back to those moments in time. And I was wondering, was it really difficult to find those? And I'm just wondering, for those of us who may want to go looking for audio clips for pieces to be able to embed and include in our own projects.
Those were both from the Kennedy Library. If you typed in JFK Library, it'll lead you there. And it's a wealth of information, and it did take a while, but you can do your search so you can do audio files, or, you know, you can kind of parse it so that you can kind of focus in on what you're looking for. I kind of figure people would rather listen to President Kennedy than me anyways.
I don't know about that, but it was appreciated all the same. And thanks for that answer.
You're welcome. I just remember, you know, I was in 3rd grade when President Kennedy was assassinated, and started walking home from school. They let us out, and just running, just being so scared. And, you know, not sure why, but thought no one's going to assassinate me. But it was interesting. And I just wanted to say one other last thing, personal. My parents were at the Kennedy inauguration, and there was a picture of them with Kennedy. He visited where I lived in Niagara Falls, and they were with him. And my mom was one of the ladies at Jacqueline's inauguration or event. So kind of had that personal touch.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for the presentation. We'd have just a couple of minutes until the top of the